I want to welcome you all. 안녕하세요. 안녕하세요. Guten Morgen. Ohayo gozaimasu. That's all I know. There are thousands of languages, right? But we know our language models do not cover all of those thousands of languages. And most of the papers that we're seeing this week at Column focus on English, but there are some papers I wanted to highlight and show you here that are talking about languages other than English. And Chinese, simplified Chinese is another one that's really big. But we do have other languages like Taiwanese Mandarin, Japanese, Persian, which is great. And we also have a paper on African American English. So when we talk about these languages, it's not really like English is one single language. Sometimes the LLMs trained to be really good at English are not really good at some of the dialects. So that's really interesting, I think. Another set of really great papers talk about cross-lingual or multilingual aspects of LLMs. And I think this set of papers really tell us that when we do multilingual LLMs, it's not just to cover the different languages. I mean, not only to just cover the different languages we have in the world, but also when you actually talk about these or think about these cross-lingual or multilingual aspects of language models, you can actually solve some of the really difficult problems for the English language model as well. For example, how do you make it more efficient? How do you make it do better reasoning, tokenization? A lot of these really important and serious and difficult questions come only to light only when you look at these cross-lingual aspects of LLMs. So that's another reason we should be looking at multilingual models. And we also have a set of papers. And I wanted to highlight Multifact, which is talking about factuality, is our paper, so please come and see the poster right after the oral session today. And the last set of papers talk about culture, right? So why do we talk about culture when we're talking about language models? I think it's because, we're actually well situated here right next to the Annenberg Center for Communication, or School of Communication right next door. When you think about language models, what we're trying to do is make better communication tools, right? So when you think about these large language models as being helpful for us humans to communicate with one another, then you really cannot ignore the cultural aspects of language, right? So really wonderful set of papers, and let me just go right into introducing the speakers for this session. I'll do very quick introduction of each speaker before they come up for their short presentations. So we have Hwaran Lee, who is at Naver in Korea. We have Sunipa Dev, who is at Google Research. And also we have Sampo Husalo from Finland at the University of Turku. So our first speaker, first panelist who's going to give us a few minutes of her research is Hwaran Lee at Naver, who is a lead research scientist at Naver AI, and she works on natural language processing and machine learning, especially at the problem of understanding humanity and society to further develop human-like and trustworthy AI. So without further ado, let me give it over to Hwaran.
Yep. Hello, good morning. My name is Hwaran Lee from Naver, and thank you for having me. I will introduce the evaluation of multilingual LLM from local and regional perspectives. Okay. So the current state-of-the-art LLMs like GPT-4 or Llama 3 is primarily focused on English. However, according to Ethnologue, only about 1/5 of global population speaks English, and there's over 7,000 more languages spoken globally. Many of these languages remain unexplored, and even a single language like English can be used in multiple countries. So therefore, to make more inclusive LLMs, there are several approaches to enable them to understand and generate other languages. So for example, training from scratch with large amount of data in the targeting language. For example, in Korea, we have HyperClova, which is trained on mainly Korean and English. And the other approach could be cross-lingual adaptation. The last one could be training with multilingual corpora. So here is my question. When we evaluating this kind of multilingual LLMs, what should we consider from local and regional perspectives? So I just categorized some perspectives, aspects. So we can consider the following aspects: the overall performance in the target language, including understanding, generation, knowledge, and reasoning. But we should pay attention to local knowledge, such as local knowledge and cultural understanding, which vary across different countries and regions. Finally, we must also consider various safety aspects that are influenced by the local societal context. So how can you evaluate LLMs in these categories, and what data set and benchmark should we use? I brought some example of South Korea and in Korean. So in the case of ours, a variety of Korean data sets have been developed. While some are simply translations of English benchmark, most have been carefully constructed from local resources and manually created. So here in the short talk, let me introduce a case of social bias, namely co-BBQ dataset. So we start from BBQ dataset, which evaluates implicit social bias of a language model in QA task. In this task, the model answers to a discriminatory question with a context by choosing an answer among biased answer, counter-biased answer, and unknown. With this ambiguous context, the correct answer is provided. However, with ambiguous context, although the correct answer is unknown, the model tends to answer based on its bias. But the problem is the BBQ benchmark is rooted in US culture. Different cultures may have different contexts or target groups associated with social bias. Therefore, we need to be much more carefully and culturally aware approach. So this is our framework to construct co-BBQ. We systematically construct the data set within this framework. First, we categorize the original BBQ dataset into 3 groups. We firstly remove samples that do not reflect existing stereotypes in Korean society. Secondly, we modify targets to correctly represent minority groups. And thirdly, we directly transfer common stereotypes. And lastly, we add stereotypes that are unique to our society. After conducting culture-sensitive translation, we validate these stereotypes through a large-scale survey to ensure they are recognized by the general public. So by doing so, we construct our data set, and then with this newly constructed benchmark, we evaluated several models with accuracies and bias scores. As we expected, models tend to favor outputs aligned with prevailing social bias. But I want to emphasize this. We also empirically found that machine translation is not enough for cultural adaptations. With our handcrafted bias benchmark, models performs better to understand correctly and also shows higher bias scores. To summarize, we carefully constructed Korean bias benchmark here, and this adaptation framework is also adaptable to other cultures. Therefore, we encourage to create culture-specific bias benchmark. So finally, here are the key takeaways of my brief talk. to effectively incorporate local perspectives into LLMs, we first need a high-quality evaluation benchmark that includes locality and safety considerations. Beyond the social bias I introduced earlier, there are still other important aspects to consider, such as social value or social norms. As a future work, it's essential to ensure that these models are also aligned with diverse linguistic and cultural aspects. So this is my talk.
Thank you. We'll get to the questions at the end. So let me now introduce our second speaker, who is Sunipa Dev, working as a senior research scientist at Google Research. I'm going to skip over the couple of sentences and say that her research, Sunipa's research, is really remarkable. She strives to ground evaluations of generative AI, including large language models, especially language technologies in real-world experiences of people, and foster inclusion of diverse, cross-cultural, and marginalized perspectives into the AI pipelines. So let me introduce Sunipa.
All right. Thanks so much for the very warm welcome, and hello, everyone. It's really great to be here today discussing this very topical issue, because as we continue to grow our models and build more and more capabilities into them, it has become really pertinent that we reflect on who these models are able to serve, who they're able to incorporate into the models, right? But not just in a multilingual way, but a multicultural way. Whose values and norms and perspectives and needs are we really serving? It goes without saying that we have seen an immense amount of progress in the last half decade or so, and the sheer diversity of tasks that our models are now able to perform is staggering. But how multilingual and how globally inclusive is this progress? This is a question that we still don't have an answer for, because despite growing our models, we know that there are only certain populations and their beliefs, their perspectives, that truly get incorporated into the models, and the generations similarly can falter. And this is not something that's new. We have known this since a long time, and this is Common Crawl and its representation of people and languages, which is often taken as a proxy for a lot of the data sets that go into our models. And we know that this does have a strong English and Western world bias. So when we ask the question of who do our models represent and what sort of generations do we get out of them, we do have an answer, that there is indeed a very big skew. On top of this data, when we build out our annotation pipelines to ground our data both for training or testing, even there we have a lot of skews again, because annotators are not uniformly distributed at the global scale. They are probably concentrated in a few different locations, and this means that a lot of different perspectives are not really making their way into our pipelines. And when we consider that there are many sensitive topics or harmful language tasks and socio-culturally subjective tasks that annotators are subjected to, we can see how this would be a major problem. Because when we deploy a model and we don't consider the different safety standards across the world, we don't really know if the models are doing well across languages and across cultures. The research in this area, too, has seen a very similar kind of skew. So this is, again, a proxy ARR statistics of what languages are being centered in various papers. And again, English has the lead, whereas a lot of other languages are trailing behind or in the long tail, and many other languages are not even represented. So again, when we think about what sort of evaluations, what sort of resources are being built, we know that they are primarily being built in English, and oftentimes they are being translated into a lot of the other languages that we want to cater to. Now, is translation really sufficient? Language, after all, is not a random string of words, a random string of phrases that we can exactly translate from one language to the other and expect to capture every single nuance or the socio-cultural context within which it lives. So this is not maybe the most effective way to go about ensuring the safety and utility of our models. So I'll give a small example, and this time I won't use English, I'll use Bengali, which is my native tongue. So Bengali is a Southeast Asian language, which is spoken in India and Bangladesh primarily. And Bangal is a term that is present in both countries in the language. But in one country, it has a lot of stereotypical and offensive connotations and can also be used as a slur, whereas that's not true in the other country. So even when we consider one language, the cultural context can differ. A lot of other factors can come into ascertaining if a word is offensive or not, if it's stereotypical or not, and so much more. So even within the language, we can't really say one culture is captured entirely. So when we go across languages, the problem really compounds. So keeping this in mind, a couple of years ago, we set out to create a resource of stereotypes that would have global coverage, or we would aim to have global coverage, and expand it not just multilingually, but also multiculturally. And the way we set it up was that we used a bunch of existing grounded resources collected through community surveys or UNESCO data and so on. And we used them to seed competent multilingual models like Palm or Gemini or GPT-4 and so on. We prompt them, and the models are able to understand the pattern of stereotypes and generate a large number of similar associations across languages and identity groups and so on. This would also have a lot of noise, so not everything would be a stereotype. To ground this in social knowledge, we annotate them in a very globally situated way. So what this means is, let's say we have Bengali stereotypes. We would get them annotated by Bengali speakers living in India and in Bangladesh, and we would get sociocultural nuance into our resource and avert Western gaze about whether something is a stereotype or not. So what this yields is a really large resource of about 35,000 stereotypes or so across 24 languages and many different regions that were not represented before. And this notion of whether something is a stereotype or not is grounded in different societies. It's not just one ground truth that exists everywhere, because that doesn't really exist. Now, this has actually helped bolster a lot of our evaluations. So you can use a resource like this in many different ways. One example here is in a QA kind of setup to test if models are using stereotypical information when generating text. And what we found is not only do they endorse these stereotypes multilingually, which is in the languages that they were collected in, but also in English. So irrespective of what we are prioritizing in a language model, if it sees data from other languages, it will contain a lot of stereotypes and a lot of offensive and harmful connotations. So if our evaluations are centered only on protecting stereotypes that are known in the English language, we will fail. We also noticed that there is a discrepancy in the rate of endorsement across the multilingual aspects and the English language, which tells us that the guardrails or the evaluations and interventions that we have built for the English language doesn't really translate over to a lot of the other languages. So there are two things here. One is that we need to collect and curate resources in a very intentional manner for different locations, for different languages, but also we need to have interventions and evaluations that cater to those multicultural aspects and not just expect that whatever pipeline we have built for one language is going to carry over to all of the different languages of the world. So with this, I'll stop. This work was done in collaboration with a lot of wonderful people, and I'm excited to chat more about this work today and even offline. So thank you.
Thank you, Sunipa. So our last speaker is Sampo Pusalo, who is a leader of the Turku NLP group in Finland, I think, and a research fellow at the Department of Computing, University of Turku. His work focuses on machine learning for NLP with particular application domains, including the scientific text mining. And today, I think you will focus on the Finnish language technology. So let's welcome Sampo.
Thank you for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. So I'm very happy to have the opportunity to discuss this important topic, and delighted to notice that our perspectives are, I believe, very much aligned. However, me being in Finland, mine is perhaps a bit more European, as well as me being Finnish, a bit more pessimistic. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that LLMs are leaving the non-English speaking world behind. This is in some sense just the status quo in NLP since forever, but it is also a missed opportunity, because given how much we can now do with unannotated data, we could be lifting up so many languages instead of just focusing on English. But instead what we get is something like this. We see that with increasing distance that a language has from English, performance goes down, and to add insult to injury, cost goes up with worse tokenization. So we find that at the same time as GPT is, for example, reported to ace the bar exam in English, research shows that the same model only passes primary school exams in Indonesian. This is an issue both in the industry as well as in academia. So leading academic efforts, not to mention any names, are near exclusively focused on English, and massively multilingual models tend to be compromises. We also can't rely on the generosity of big tech, as was clearly demonstrated recently through the fact that Meta is no longer making the most recent version of Llama available in Europe. Continued pre-training is often offered as a solution, but it's only a partial one. To integrate deep and broad cultural knowledge, it's not clear that it's sufficient to continue training a model that's seen 1 trillion tokens of English after the fact. And the goal here is we shouldn't allow our languages and cultures to be second-class citizens, and perhaps the only way really to guarantee that is to assure representation of our languages also in the base models that we train. So a few words about the situation in Europe. We have 24 official languages in the EU and 45 or so official languages in Europe, with more than 200 spoken, covering a range of language families and written in a number of scripts. Many of these languages are comparatively low resource, such as Finnish, shown here, or highlighted here, and not of primary commercial interest to the big players. To look at Finnish a bit more specifically, the language is spoken natively by about 5 million people only. And even if we put together everything that we can find online and in national resources, we can only get about 40 billion good tokens of the language. Now we can stretch that out a bit. It turns out that we can do 4 repetitions of the data to go to around 160 billion tokens. But it still means that for monolingual Finnish training, we hit a data wall that doesn't allow us to reasonably train a model beyond 10 billion parameters or so. And here a key point for us is that multilinguality doesn't need to be a curse, the way it's often seen in the field, but can be a blessing. As for people and models, we can learn much more if we don't limit ourselves to texts that are not just in Finnish. I want to say a few words about our work. So we've been creating language families from scratch with a focus on Finnish. We first introduced a family of Finnish models up to 13 billion parameters, hitting that data wall for monolinguality, and we're then able to stretch from that to 34 billion parameters by introducing English and code. We're now working, or actually have very recently completed Nordic models and are currently working on models for all EU languages. I do want to note that we are far from the only group working on this. There's dozens of similar efforts in Europe, several of them specifically targeting all EU languages. So this is both a signal that the perspective that this sort of local work is necessary is broadly shared, but it is also kind of redundant effort in part. Just in brief summary, Big tech and regrettably also leading academic efforts in LLMs are failing most of the languages in the world, as well as most of the people. In Europe, there are open efforts that are supporting our local languages, but the models we're able to create are far from the frontier. We can do better, and I think here focus should be on data. And in terms of compute, as long as we are able to collaborate instead of compete, which sadly is not the situation at the moment, I think we might be able to do reasonably well. Also, I'd like to suggest you to consider giving multilinguality a chance in the next model you train. You don't need to sacrifice a lot of either your tokenizer capacity or your token budget to add another language to the next model you create. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think the three speakers, I mean, even briefly, they've highlighted really important questions that we, as a community of language modeling researchers, should be asking ourselves, right? These are really difficult questions with limited resources, both in terms of human resource and also computational resource. Limited data. What do we focus? What are the really challenging questions we should be asking ourselves about taking these LLMs to be multilingual and multimodal too, and much more inclusive? And I should say, sort of apologetically, that this panel actually represents a small sort of partial view of when we look at the global view, right? So we don't have anyone speaking on behalf of the African countries. We tried to get somebody. We actually did try to get someone who does a lot of African NLP. He unfortunately couldn't come because of travel and visa issues, so that's another sort of side issue we can talk about. And we also don't have many of the Latin American languages represented here as well. And that's not just the panel, but the conference itself. So really, we're very, very far from being inclusive with our technologies. I will ask these two major questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So as they sort of warm up with these answering these two questions, you can sort of prepare in your mind what you want to ask the panelists today. And I think Sampo actually already sort of addressed this question, first question. What is the gap? Are we, so, you know, one of the slides that he showed, which shows the state of the language, the different languages in the NLP world, that was from at least 2-3 years ago from ACL, right? And that was sort of like a wake-up call. So it's, you know, saying to the NLP community, we should actually be looking at more languages. But since then, have we made progress? Progress being, are we sort of narrowing the gap between the high-resource languages, such as English and Chinese and maybe like German, French, whatever, and you know, the really low resources, as well as like the medium resource languages. Are we making progress? So that's my first question. Anyone who wants to take it first, please?
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so I think the gap is different. It's not a one-dimensional line where we are making progress entirely and we are narrowing the gap or we are making the gap wider. But there are newer challenges with every iteration of progress that we have seen. We may have more languages somewhat covered with models able to generate meaningful, coherent sentences in a larger set of languages. But are we really mindful of what are the cultures being represented? Are different artifacts that are important to people, values, norms being represented by the models? I don't think that's an answer we have yet. So understanding the gap with respect to that is also very hard. for also a lot of languages, we don't know what tasks are actually needed by the communities. We can't really have the same set of tasks, like whether it's summarization or something that we've once identified was really useful in English. We can't use the same set of tasks and apply it to every single language in the world and call that progress. Progress is also about identifying what are the tasks that are, or what are the problems we need to solve, and what are the tasks that need to be built, and then have progress along that line. So I don't know if that helps, but the gap is different.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. It's not a single-dimensional thing. Well, there's certainly been progress in some aspects, such as tokenization is getting better, which is a low bar to cross. But as there's increasing shift to applications that require specialized training data, I worry that the gap is in fact increasing. And just to take one example, as we're training models on massive amounts of chain of thought data so that the models in some sense fairly literally think in English, I think there's an increasing and potentially risky gap there, because the models will then only speak other languages in translation, quite literally. And yeah, I worry that in a lot of respects, the gap may actually be growing.
Yeah, so we are seeing, for example, certain O1, maybe, O1 preview. If you look at the thinking steps, which, there's not a lot of transparency, but you can kind of tell that it is doing some kind of reasoning steps only in the English language. So thank you for those questions. Let me have you briefly answer this question. I think people are already lined up. So there was a lot of mention of culture, but what exactly is culture? There's some, social stereotypes we mentioned, maybe toxicity, but what aspects of culture do we really need to focus on, and how is language and culture different, or are they actually different? It's the second question.
Yes, in my perspective, languages could be included in culture. So language can be reflected. Language is influenced by cultures, such as like linguistic attributes or like stereotypical expressions. And culture sometimes requires knowledge. So cultural understanding is required to be learned by the language model. And so I want to emphasize that not only to increase the performance of linguistic characteristics, we also empower language models to know about culture knowledges and culture attributes too.
Yep. Okay, thank you. Sunipa, did you want to add something, or Sampo?
Sure. Yeah, I don't think culture and language can be disentangled that well. I feel they're very inherently linked. To answer your question of like, what does it mean for a model to be, I guess, culturally relevant, or what does it mean for culture, to be incorporated? What are the axes? I think even those things can differ per language, per culture. And I think I just keep going back to understanding in collaboration with, working with different languages, different communities, what does it mean for culture to be represented for them? Is it their specific set of values? Is it just the artifacts that they have? Or what is it that needs to be represented for us to call a model really competent in representing that culture? I don't think there is one formula which will apply again for every single language or every single culture or every single location. But I don't think we can disentangle language from culture entirely.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I really like your point that you actually need to go into the community to find out what they want and how they define culture. Okay, so let's now go to the audience questions. So maybe we can start from there, yeah? And it would be good if you can introduce yourself quickly.
Hi, Jessica Ford, Brown University. So one of the things that I've been thinking about recently has been how, there's been a lot of talk around consent to training, and for a lot of speakers of various languages, especially languages for which the community of speakers have had a history of colonization, there's a lot of additional anxiety about giving permission to data usage. Now, if these languages do have a lack of resourcedness, that adds to certain technical concerns. So I'm kind of curious about how you're thinking about these technical ethical trade-offs. And one thing I've heard other people trying to do to square that would be to use synthetic data, but also those have ethical concerns as well. So I'm kind of curious about those particular two aspects of training and how you are all thinking about that.
Perhaps my perspective is not the most valuable here. I think we're a very Western culture, and the way that these issues are seen in Finland and most of Europe looks quite a lot like how they are seen in the US.
I think that's a very, very important point, right? Like when we think about how do we mindfully include languages into a model, whatever language it is, I think it's very important to consider what it means to be included. And there are these very important ethical considerations, not necessarily trade-offs perhaps, but considerations that need to be made. When we are talking about communities that are really small and have low computational resources and we want to be inclusive, I think the first step is understanding what inclusivity means. I think some of that question about do we use synthetic data goes back to what is the task we are trying to fulfill for them. I feel like often it's about we have an application that we can run and we can do it in a billion or whatever number of languages, so let's just have the data and run it. But is that really useful? I think if we are able to answer that question, some of these considerations fall into place. Yeah, that would be my sort of perspective.
Thank you. I think it, if I may add a little bit, I think it calls for interdisciplinary collaboration. We really need to be talking with linguists, sociologists, who actually work with the communities. And there's actually a NERPS paper coming out soon about indigenous languages in New Zealand and how they get the community of those, their speakers to really discuss what do we actually need and how do we collect data from these indigenous language speakers. Difficult question. Okay, maybe go here.
Hello, thanks for interesting discussion. My name is Alexei, I'm from NVIDIA. And my question is, I guess, a bit on the more practical side. So these days, I would say the conventional approach to cover low resource languages in large language model is to start from a really strong multilingual LLM where, say, set of languages are equally represented on a tokenizer level, but we do train mostly, on English just because it has tens of trillions of tokens, and you cannot learn, say, a world model from 40 billion tokens, right? So basically, what we would do is we do a multilingual model, and then sort of continue train on, say, low resource language of interest. So my question is there a better way we can use right now?
I'm not aware of one. I would love to hear of one if there is. I think that is actually an excellent point and goes to quite a lot of what we're thinking in terms of what it means to have a Finnish model for, in our case, for example. So quite a lot of the information that we get into our model does indeed come from English training data, which represents by far the majority of what we train on. But the result is a model that is definitely influenced by the perspectives in that data, not only the information, the knowledge. So just to take an example, when we generate from our models, even in prompted in Finnish, they do tend to fall back to Anglicisms, and in some cases they tend to fall back to speaking English. So I think it's a question to which we at least don't have the answer to and are kind of actively struggling with. But yeah, definitely fluent generation of a new language is a very low bar, and I think evaluation and kind of trying to get an understanding of whether a model is reasonably representing a culture and cultural knowledge should involve far more than just seeing whether it can generate reasonably fluent-looking text in that language. And yeah, I'm afraid I don't have the answer, but it's a very interesting question that I hope we can continue to pursue as a community.
Thank you.
Of course.
Something? Oh, okay. I want to add something like, in order to adapt low resource language, we could think about post-training using the low resource language. So I think what we need to focus on is how efficiently adapt to such a low resource language. So for example, like we can think about how to make sequence of mixing those low resource language and or like mixing low resource language with English together to connect the language together to make align both languages. So this could be one approach, promising approach.
Yeah, yes, yeah, actually just want to add on this point. Yeah, we did notice that on the post-training side, you don't want to just translate. You actually need to collect from native speakers of the language. Yeah, right. Thank you.
Thank you. Back to this side.
Yep. Hi, this is Jinjae from Wisconsin and Madison. So my question here is that the field is having a large barriers in terms of collecting high quality, low resource language data. And a lot of the time when we create a lot of this data, and the strategy we do is just rebalancing the data set and rebalancing the tokenizer and so on. But there's no mechanisms that can help us to prevent broadcasting the stereotypes from mixing the data only. Like a lot of the methodology we have done so far has been focused on the data, but there's no like mechanisms in terms of optimizing the model from like broadcasting some like misinformation or stereotypes across different cultures, across different languages. So my question here is that down the road, what should we do in order to actually prevent the model from like creating a lot of this hallucination? For example, if let's say some language might have some conflict with the other culture or other languages, but if we don't identify those cultural norms or social norms that cannot be shared across languages, then this will also increase the hallucination, the multilingual hallucination of these models. So we really not only need to just focus on the data, but I also want to see your thoughts. And I think this is a question for the whole audience here to think about how we can optimize the model to prevent sharing unique informations.
That is an excellent question, honestly. And I want to flag that in the last year or so, we have seen a lot of growth also in the amount of cultural knowledge that has been collected by the community. There have been a lot of papers that are focused on not just stereotypes or harmful language, but what are the positive things that people would want the model to respond. Let's say I ask a question in a specific language for a specific location, what is really beneficial for the model to respond as? And all of the knowledge that we have collected, I think is a step in the right direction. I completely hear you that oftentimes when we are looking at the quality of the data in the training phase, it has a very different meaning of what quality can mean there. And once we are using the model that has been trained and we want to understand and we want to make it better in a lot of these terms, I think the interventions, the evaluations go hand in hand with a lot of these resources. I think these problems have been solved in some other areas, whether it was using knowledge graphs during recommender systems or search retrieval systems. I think we can learn from a lot of that, bring all of those techniques in now that we have the resources to implement some of it. And I'm really excited to see where in the next year or so we go, because I think this problem was identified relatively, the problem was identified, but then it gained momentum relatively recently. But then since then, we've seen an immense amount of progress. So I am hopeful.
Okay, next question maybe from also this side.
Hi, my name is Adam. I'm from the University of Washington. I want to thank you for bringing these perspectives to this conference. I really appreciate it. A lot of my work centers global public health in resource-scarce settings. And my question for you is also kind of about this data side. I kind of share your pessimism in the sense that, for example, Tanzania, it's unlikely that there will be a model that will be able to do the kind of things that we can do in English anytime soon. And so in these settings, my question is, in a very practical sense, I would love to hear from your thoughts on ways that we could sort of improve what we're trying to do in these applied settings. For example, if we have like a narrative, people going to remote villages and collecting text data, translating it using automatic translation into English to then feed into the model versus hiring people in that country to do high quality translations, these types of things on the data side. I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
Thank you. Very good question, and I think this relates to what Alice also pointed out, that I think most of the languages we're discussing here are not truly low resource. If you can put together 10 billion good tokens, you're doing pretty well. And regrettably, well, this means that we can apply the techniques that we have now for the majority of the population on the planet. We can't do it for the majority of languages. And I worry that the whole LLM wave of research is fundamentally inapplicable to quite a substantial majority of the world's languages. And I, again, regrettably have no solutions to offer here. I think machine translation is definitely going to fall short. Gathering high-quality resources that represent native speakers' use of the language as well as local culture is going to be critical, but probably massively too expensive for most applications in truly low-resource settings. So I fear that that may be something that's somewhat out of reach with the current technology.
I would like to add one thing,
Okay.
that compute isn't cheap either. When we talk about resources, often that becomes a conversation. But for example, the stereotype example that I shared, we had tried doing this for many different languages in many more different regions than we actually ended up being able to do it for using models. Because, for example, we wanted French in Senegal, and when we were trying to generate, the quality was really poor, and it didn't represent anything remotely from Senegal, and we learned that it was more of an oral language as opposed to a written language there, and a lot of resources aren't really there, so we won't be able to do it. So in those scenarios, I think we need to have more community-focused outreach, like you said, like hiring people in the country to generate or get to really high-quality data, high-quality text that can be used for a specific purpose. I think if we narrow down a specific use case, I think it's more manageable maybe, both in terms of cost and feasibility. And I think that might be the way forward for, yeah.
Yeah, so there are, I really like that community-driven effort. So I should probably highlight like the AYA project that many of you probably know, and also David's project on African NLP, I'm forgetting the name, but there are people who are working in this space. We're making some progress, I think, with those projects, but still a long way to go. But thank you for that question. Okay,
Thank you.
Yeah. Side?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for a really wonderful panel. I'm Martin Sapp from CMU. I had a bunch of questions, so I'll definitely try to find it all offline. But one question that I had was kind of this idea of like multilingual models versus like non-English models. And I'm wondering to what extent we want like one model that is fully representing all languages, and as a corollary is like good and safe to use for all users in all countries and language speakers, versus many LLMs that are maybe like more language specific or language family specific, especially given sort of what we know about the practical tensions around like optimizing tokenization for every single script or things like that, and to what extent we want like a fully generalizable model that works for all.
Okay, so I guess a kind of shared ideal would be one model for everything. It's a kind of, most people in this community, I think, would love to have that thing that's just a single model that perfectly solves the problems for all languages and all tasks. I'm personally fairly skeptical of massively multilingual models in practice, based on what we've seen in efforts so far. And I think that in the reasonably short term, if we want to have really strong models for specific languages, I would more lean in the direction of language family specificity, or perhaps even narrower when resources exist. But I think ultimately it's an experimental question.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it has to be a combination at on some level. Maybe there are some generic tasks for which you need perfunctory knowledge of the language, where just generating one coherent sentence or a bunch of coherent sentences are enough. But I can imagine there are so many different tasks, whether it was maybe to learn a language or the task that we see now of like having an AI assistant in its specific language. I feel like as we go into more detailed tasks and application scenarios, there will be languages that we can't really cover with one general model, because like what you pointed out, right? Like often the models are thinking in English because they've seen so much data in English, and then they are doing some sort of translation behind the screen, which isn't really what is ideal. So I think my solution would be a complement of different models, both one large, somewhat multilingual model, but then other small specific models that are catered to a language family perhaps, and so on.
I want to add my perspective. When it comes to knowledge, I think excluding English not good option. So, for example, like if we collect only Korean data to build our Korean language model, I think it's because most expert knowledge is in English. So without those English data, it's hard to complete some knowledge-related task in Korean. So only one and only language model could not be a good option, I think.
Absolutely agree.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, back to this side.
Okay, I'll try and keep this short. Michael, UC Santa Barbara. I think I really agree with the vision you guys are talking about how we need to center culture when we're talking about multilinguality. But I think a big issue we've been dealing with is eliciting good representative cultural information from speakers is a challenge, because language is very parallel. You can say, okay, here's the speakers speaking English, here's the speakers speaking Spanish, let's take the data. But when you want to say, okay, give me a set of culturally representative concepts that are meaningful to you and the facts about them, it's easy to fall into the trap of basically we do the stereotyping when we ask them for the things. So we say, okay, well, in America, we know all about geishas. So hey, Japanese person, answer these questions, blah blah blah. So how do you get around that issue? And if you, to the extent you've been doing like data collection for cultures you're not familiar with, like what's your approach to try and not impart your own biases on that when you're collecting like cultural information?
So maybe just have a quick answer and then try to get the last question as well.
Sorry, I didn't really keep it that short.
No, sorry. Good question though.
I'll try to answer very shortly. Regarding data collection from languages you don't represent, don't. I would suggest to involve the people who do. And for data for kind of smaller resource languages, involve memory organizations. We work with like the National Library to get data that represents Finnish culture and Finnish history and so on. And I think that's an important approach.
Yeah. Do we?
Yeah. Okay. Maybe go on to the next
Happy to
question.
chat more offline.
Yeah.
I think that's a very loaded question that I have a lot of thoughts on in research.
So hello, I'm Pedro Ortiz from the Common Core Foundation. Okay, and I wanted to ask a question particularly because a graph was shown about, well, the Common Core dataset. And well, in light on just the answer that you gave, Sampo, also, well, I mean, I don't like the distribution shown in that graph. We want to change the distribution shown in that graph, but we are just 9 people at the Common Crawl Foundation, and yeah, what concrete effort do you want to see from an organization like ours and from the community at large to actually change the distribution of the graph? Like what kind of, I don't know, initiative, like for instance, we'd like to see us collaborating with the community?
I can give a very short answer. I don't think the onus is only on like one organization or one group that's either creating the data or using the data, but all of us as a community, I think. Yeah. If we have been like creating resources and creating models with an English-first sort of approach, because that's what's available to us, which is very valid. But now that we have seen so much progress, I think we can create better, more intentional resources. If we know there are gaps that we cannot fill the way we have been with like the existing resources, existing pipelines, we need to think outside the box, go, like I think somebody pointed out, I think Adam pointed out in a question before, yeah, that we go hire people in respective countries that we think are underrepresented, underserved, and then create those resources that would change the graph, not just for one resource, but all the net resources we have and the net models we build.
Okay, thank you for that question, and thank you for coming from Common Crawl. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to everyone who asked really wonderful questions. We really actually don't have the answers to these questions, so let's make progress going forward. And next year, when we have the second column, I hope we will be better in many of the languages. Thank you so much.